Hello, everyone. Minesh Gurn, aka the Psychedelic Scientist here, letting you know about a scheduling change for the second cohort of our 8-week live taught online course, Psychedelic Neuroscience Demystified: How Psychedelics Alter Consciousness and Produce Therapeutic Effects. This course is now starting on November 1st, so you've still got some time to enroll. The course consists of a combination of live group classes and in-depth video lectures, which will give you a solid understanding of the key concepts and findings in psychedelic neuroscience. You'll also have ample opportunity to connect with like-minded peers to discuss all of the content. We make things as accessible and relevant as possible by highlighting real-world practical applications and building from the basic to the more complex. So whether you're a mental health professional, researcher, or just interested in expanding your knowledge, this course will provide you with a deeper understanding of the neuroscience of psychedelics. Classes start on November 1st, and you can find out more information and enroll at psychedeliceducationcenter.com.
Every year, psychedelics are becoming more accepted into mainstream culture, and people all over the world are asking themselves, how can I get the skills, foundations, and tools to build a meaningful career in psychedelics? Well, that is exactly where Vital comes in. Our 12-month interdisciplinary practitioner training program is robust, inclusive, and most of all transformative, both personally and professionally. Our graduates have gone on to do many different things in the psychedelic space, like working at ketamine clinics, consulting on clinical trials, opening a retreat center, starting their own coaching or wellness practice, and even launching a psychedelic media and merchandise platform, and so much more. Classes start January 23rd, and our application deadline is December the 20th. But if you apply and enroll before November the 19th, you'll save $750 from tuition. Head to vitalpsychedelictraining.com to download our full course curriculum. You can also check out our events page at psychedelictoday.com to sign up for an upcoming Q&A session or to join an expert-led topical taster webinar. Find out whether Vital is the transformative journey you've been looking for.
Hey everybody, what's up? It's Joe here. Just wanted to let you know about an upcoming class we have going in Denver. We're actually producing a Navigating Psychedelics 2-day edition for all of you out there that want some in-person ed. So we just ran it in Miami, and it was an amazing success. And we're going to do it again in Denver on November 10 and 11. And we would love to have you there. If you want to learn about it, psychedelicstoday.com/events. We are going to run through 2 days of material. We're actually even going to give you an impressive breathwork experience that hopefully helps you understand that experience and how it's useful. So anyway, go over to psychedelicstoday.com/events to learn more, and we would love to see you there in Denver.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. It's David here, having a chat with Alexander Beiner from many different fields and hats and realms, including DMT realms. So today I think you're probably in London's realm, are you, Ali?
I'm the realm of London right now, yeah.
Beautiful. Absolute joy to have you here. It was a pleasure meeting you at Breaking Convention back in April, and I've just read your book. It was my first ever Audible book, and it took me a week to listen to it rather than like 6 months to read it kind of by my bedside table. So congrats on your book. You want to just tell us what's it called and how's it going launching a book like this so far?
Yeah, well, firstly, thanks for having me on, and yeah, likewise, it was a real pleasure to hang out at Breaking Convention. So my book is called The Bigger Picture: How Psychedelics Can Help Us Make Sense of the World. And elevator pitch for it is, instead of how to change your mind, what I'm focusing on is how to change society. So I'm very interested in, as the title kind of suggests, looking at the bigger picture, looking at where we are right now in this time in history, trying to make sense of that in different ways, and then specifically looking at how can psychedelic experiences help us meet the challenges we now face collectively. And also, of course, a big part of that is how can they help us make sense of our own lives? How can they help us make sense of the internet, for example, and navigate this very strange realm that we all dip in and out of constantly, which is, I argue, quite a shamanic process in itself. How to, approach polarizing conversations and topics that come up in our very high-tech, convoluted, sometimes pretty challenging culture. And so, yeah, my main thrust is that psychedelics, going mainstream right now is kind of fraught with potential, but also danger. And that to do it right, we really need to meet them with the level of complexity and compassion and nuance. And if we can do that, then they can really become powerful tools for how we collectively together, sort of, holding hands, find a way through the various crises we face right now and into something, into a new reality of some kind.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really multidisciplinary book, and you clearly did a ton of research in there. Like you're mentioning a lot of experts in the space, a lot of research articles and kind of clinical stuff, and yeah, more metaphysical and philosophical work as well as just great community based and corporate examples that are good and bad and ugly. All of them. Before we dive into the book, and there's loads there. I want to hear about you as a person, if that's cool, Ali. I'd love you just to intro yourself. And it's funny, in the book itself, we've had quite a bit in common, you and me. So obviously living in England, having family and in Frankfurt, Germany, and having lived in a houseboat as well. Both of us have done that, and both of our dads were printers.
Yeah,
so I'm not trying to project anything onto you. I'm just. So those are parts of you that I already know about. What other parts do you bring into the world, would you say, if you want to just tell folks a wee bit about you?
Yeah, first, I'm so happy about these parallels. I really love. And yeah, as you mentioned, I'm half Irish and half German. So I suppose I grew up in a very international environment. I went to an international school in Germany, and then I studied at university in Ireland. And now I live in the UK and I've lived here for almost 15 years or so. So yeah, and you know what? That sort of touches on something that's always been part of who I am, I think, and maybe why I've been so drawn to psychedelics is that I feel like I'm in a kind of third category very often, whatever country I live in. Even growing up in Germany, I'm half German, but I'm not fully identified with German culture or fully identified with Irish culture. I play traditional Irish music. I got really into, as I think a lot of people from dual nationalities sometimes do, I got very into wanting to connect with, in this case, the nationality of the country I didn't grow up in. And I feel like a very deep affinity to Irish history and Irish folklore and Irish music that I don't quite know why it's so deep, because it wasn't a major thing growing up in my family. It was present a little bit, but I just really was drawn to it. And so, yeah, so that's something very close to my heart. And there's something about the traditionalism of folk music as well that is a very nice counterbalance to the wild psychonautical explorations that I enjoy too. So I think that sense of being slightly on the outside, or maybe occupying a few different identities and realms, is something that I find I find myself very comfortable in. And I had my first psychedelic experience when I was, I think, 18, and I just felt immediate homecoming. It wasn't even particularly that high a dose. It was, a medium dose, and I had this sense of complete familiarity, is the best way I could describe it, and a real feeling that it was deeply, deeply important. And then I got very into the academia and counterculture of psychedelia. So this is 2006, 2007. And at the time, and this is something that I care deeply about and something that I hope comes through in the book, my entry into psychedelics was through the counterculture, and through this, and part of the counterculture is this idea that psychedelics can have the potential to radically change the way we live our lives and the kind of societies we build and the kind of social game that we're playing. And part of that is seeing the ways in which it's constructed. Although I'm not a full-on constructivist, I think there's a lot of value in that. And what I'm looking at, the ideas of people like Terence McKenna, Ram Dass, Anne Shulgin, big hero of mine as well, and going, okay, there is the potential for deep transformation in society. So that was my in, and of course, alongside that, deep inner transformation and a deep sense of that psychedelics as a practice, that's something is very close to my heart and very important to me. Psychedelics combined with different practices are what's transformative, right? And also learning how to navigate the psychedelic experience well. That's always been something I've been completely fascinated by, almost like nerdy about. That's something that I never get sick of. Just the inner exploration and learning how to do that in the same way we might learn to surf or skydive is endlessly joyful for me.
Yeah, I definitely relate to the idea of psychonauts, and we are exploring kind of unknown and infinite space. I think your experiences with the DMT, as you describe them, phenomenal stuff. And I really want to go into those DMT experiences in particular. Before we do, I'm curious, Ali, how your experiences at Rebel Wisdom kind of percolated some of these ideas that are very multidisciplinary, kind of systems focused, incorporating the economic, the cultural, anthropological, the spiritual, kind of societal, kind of philosophical. What was Rebel Wisdom, and how was that a part of kind of your journey to this book and to whatever comes next?
Yeah. I mean, it was a very important part. I can answer that bit first. And very important for the book as well. So yeah, Rebel Wisdom was a media platform and also I'd say like experiences platform that I founded alongside David Fuller, who's a journalist. And we were on a kind of mission to make sense of what was going on, particularly when we started around sort of 2017, these huge social upheavals of the election of Trump and then Brexit here in the UK, trying to make sense of what was happening politically and culturally at the time. And that process brought us, it had many phases, and the YouTube channel grew to be fairly popular. By the end of it, we had about 250,000 subscribers, and we had a pretty thriving community and ran some really innovative online courses as well, which I was really proud of. And we were on a kind of inquiry, like a kind of ongoing process of inquiry into what is going on. And that also spanned, the COVID times and all the kind of culture wars around vaccines and everything else that was going on as well. So what we were trying to do was find a nuanced position in the culture wars, which if you're doing it right, you piss off both sides.
Great, win-win.
Yeah, like the left thinks you're right wing and the right thinks you're left, and you just and then there's people who share that sense of like an integral. I'm very influenced by integral philosophy, so that is kind of popularized by Ken Wilber.
Yeah, I just saw online you just hung out with him.
Yeah. We had interviewed him a few years ago, and because he lives in Denver and I was in Denver for Psychedelic Science, I thought, well, I'd love to give him a copy of the book because he's mentioned in it, but also more than that, integral. I don't know if I don't think Rebel Wisdom would have happened without integral. In fact, it wouldn't have. And then also my book was owed a lot to that, even though I don't really talk about integral explicitly in it. The idea of holding multiple perspectives, and then also what really pulled me towards it was, and this carries through Rebel Wisdom as well, this idea that deep transformative experiences and spirituality and the kind of deeper operating system of culture itself can be not explained fully, but mapped out in some way that's good enough to make sense of it better. There's this famous phrase, the map is not the territory. So, we can have a model of reality, but it isn't, reality itself. But a good map, if you can hold it lightly, is really, really powerful. And integral was one of those maps for me, not the only one. So this idea of holding multiple perspectives and understanding that different domains of knowledge and aspects of human life have different ways of knowing associated with them. And it's not that one is right or wrong. And trying to hold as many as possible and feel as many as possible at the same time. So that was the whole ethos of Rebel Wisdom. And we interviewed, I would say, some of the smartest people in the world over about 5 years. And then also, was at that time building my own theories and my own thoughts, particularly around this concept of sense making, which is the process of figuring out what's going on. But it's different to just understanding, because it's like a dynamic process where we take in information, feel it, contextualize it, act on it, and then it's very flexible because then the situation changes. We have to go, okay, that wasn't quite right. What's happening now? And so this kind of fluid process that actually is really helped by a lot of the wisdom traditions. Mindfulness helps deeply. Embodiment helps very much with that process. So at Rebel Wisdom, we also focused a lot on what are the practices we need, like who do we need to become, rather than what should we try to think about. And so that was a major influence. And part of what I wanted to do with the book as well was draw on all of those conversations with all these brilliant thinkers and everything I learned through that process, and combine that with psychedelic wisdom and psychedelic science, and various research studies that are happening, and the psychedelic underground, because I always thought there's a particularly psychedelic way of thinking, in my view. And I've talked to a bunch of people about this. And of course, we all have a different sense of what it is. But I would say that loosely, I would define it as a flexibility in how we think, and a looseness and a creativity and a playfulness with how we approach the world, that psychedelics can open up in us. And I think that's so deeply important I think it's so deeply needed right now. So my hope is to kind of combine that ethos together with a lot of very practically important and interesting, sociological, psychological, scientific and metaphysical insights, and use all of that to write a book that hopefully gives people new lenses in which to make sense of the world and psychedelics.
Beautiful. Thanks for providing that context. Okay, that was a bit of foreplay, Ali. Now we're going to just dive in, mate. There are a couple of beautiful concepts that you bring to my attention for the first time in the book that I want to just set as, in a sense, a bit of an infrastructure for understanding the fundamental themes within the book around complexity and complex systems. And two of these concepts, one is of Moloch and is Kronos and Kairos. And when I was reading that, I was like, oh, whoa, yeah, kind of feeling deeply on an archetypal level, on an energetic level, on an integral level, these complex kind of patterns and realities and energies that, in a sense, we are grappling with, we have to somehow engage with. And in a sense, part of your book is talking about Moloch and Kairos as requiring chaos, or there is chaos and there's a paradigm kind of battle going on, and what role do psychedelics play? And somehow you manage to not be like a hype fool, we're going to change the world with psychedelics. And at the same time, you're saying, really looking at the way that things are going, psychedelics probably are the best way that we can try and survive as a species, or try and, make it better. So I'd love to just hear your thoughts around Moloch and Kronos and Kairos, and kind of where these come from, and how they can, how we interact with them.
Yeah, great. I love that you chose those two, because those are two of my favorite things to talk about.
Awesome.
Yeah. So I'll start with Kronos and Kairos, because Moloch is a bigger theme. Well, I say that, I think both Kronos and Kairos are about time, so there's probably nothing bigger or more vast than that. But, so those are both Greek words, and Kronos is where we get the word chronological. So there were different words for time and different types of experience of time in ancient Greece. And so Kronos is the type we typically talk about when we say, like, what time is it, or it's time to go, or whatever it might be. It's about this kind of linear time. Kairos is a different sense of sort of this immediate present moment focus, where it's like Kairos is like this moment of potential transition or opportunity. So where everything's sort of coming together, and you have to have your wherewithal about you to seize the moment, right? So COVID was kind of a time of Kairos, where it was like, oh, everything stopped, and there was a timeless quality to it as well. And there was this moment of, we might be able to reset or do something completely different as a species, right? There's this kind of shifting, like, potentiality that, of course, we just went back to business as usual after, which was, probably quite predictable. But Kairos is also, there's this other quality, which I do talk about in the book a little bit, but is something that the philosopher Peter Kingsley talks about a lot, which is this other Greek concept of metis. And metis is like translated a bit like cunning or wherewithal, and like the chariot rider had metis, because they were completely sort of in flow with the moment, and in flow deeply with their environments, sort of deeply participating in it, like John Vervaeke will say, who I might talk about later. So and metis is also what the pre-Socratic philosophers who Kingsley writes about, Parmenides and Empedocles, who came, he argues that we have these deep shamanic roots in the West, and these early philosophers before Socrates were sort of part of this deep, almost kind of shamanic tradition, which was based around practices of transformation. And they talk about Matus a lot. And it's actually what allows us to kind of see through the matrix, in essence, a little bit like the Buddhist concept of like seeing through Maya and seeing reality as it is. So there's these deep links in ancient Greece, definitely, with like this idea of time and having this moment where we can sort of see new possibilities. And the reason I talk about Kairos in the book is because I think that is a big feature of the time we're living in. We're facing all these overlapping crises, from the environmental crisis to a crisis of meaning in the West, mental health crisis, geopolitical instability. I call it the big crisis. Some people call it the meta crisis. It's this vast sort of breakdown of the old. And when the old ways of doing things start to break down, what opens up is this realm of possibility, Kairos, right? But we have to grab it. We have to lean into it in the right way. It's quite psychedelic as well. There's moments in a psychedelic experience where it's like, okay, there's a moment of connection or ecstasis or kind of leaning in. So it's quite I always see it as quite a psychedelic kind of term. Yeah.
You mentioned you're going to come back to Moloch. I don't know if there's more about Kairos.
Yeah,
no. Matis was great.
I will move on to Moloch, actually. Yeah. So Moloch was a Canaanite god of war, like nasty god, right? And they used to sacrifice children to him, because the idea was like Moloch asks for the thing that is of most value to you, and in exchange you'll get some kind of material gain, like you might win a war or whatever it might be. So Allen Ginsberg wrote a poem called Howl, in which he kind of revives Moloch in a way, and he presents Moloch as this sort of blind consuming force of kind of capitalism, but it's a bit more than capitalism. It's like the dark god at the heart of capitalism. And like Liv Baree, who I mentioned in the book, she's a former pro poker player, and also has a really cool YouTube channel of her own. She describes it as sort of if there's a force in the universe that moves us towards greater and greater complexity and expansion, Moloch is like the opposite force of that, and actually it brings us into these like winner take all games in society that ultimately end up destroying the world and leaving everyone worse off. Although some people might be better off for a short amount of time until the whole ecosystem collapses, right? So that's Moloch. And there's an essayist called Scott Alexander who wrote Slate Star Codec, which is now Astral Codec 7, I think. Yeah, Astral Codec, I think it's called now. He wrote this amazing essay, really long, but really, really good essay called Meditations on Moloch. And he linked Moloch. This is why Moloch is popular among people who are interested in game theory, which is the economics focused on competition, competitive dynamics, which is really important to look at and understand to make sense of the world we live in, because our whole economic system, our political system, pretty much all of our institutions are run by those kind of dynamics, those kind of games. And so he points out like Moloch is basically like one big aspect of Moloch. Firstly, he says it's very important to personify, or very effective to personify, the worst aspects of our systems as a god, because it allows us to talk about it in a new way. And that's, like you, I feel this deep resonance with it. It touches something archetypal, and I think it's really powerful. And so Moloch is basically the god of these, of this concept called the multipolar trap. And that's the idea that if a game is like a multipolar trap is a game that could be like an economic game or a social game that is a race to the bottom. Like imagine, you can see the multipolar trap a little bit where even at a concert, imagine everyone's sitting down and everyone can see perfectly. And then one person stands up. It's like, okay, then the person behind them stands up, and then the person behind them has to stand up. And then eventually someone else sees it's like, oh, I can stand? Fuck that. I'm not standing. Like, oh, yeah, the person behind me is not going to be able to see, but it doesn't matter. Eventually everyone's standing. And everyone's, okay, you might be less comfortable in that situation or more. But more importantly, we see it play out in all of our institutions. So like this whole idea in academia of publish or perish is a great example of a multipolar trap, because it's like your values might be, I want to seek truth, and it might take me 10 years to really get to the bottom of this idea. But what the institution is doing, because it's in Moloch's game, is saying, no, the game is won by publishing as much as possible. Or if you're in the police, it's like, no, yeah, you have a stop and search quota. What you have to do is stop and search. So the values basically force you to either play the game and stay in the game. So do what you need to do in academia, publish as many papers as you can, or you don't play the game and then you don't get to play at all. You quit. You're like, you get fired, basically. So Moloch continuously is this force that forces us over and over again to sacrifice the deeper values that we have to kind of service this voracious god of winner take all philosophy that kind of, runs through pretty much every aspect of our society.
Beautiful. And it's interesting talking about game theory. My bachelor's degree at Nottingham University was in economics, and we studied game theory quite a bit, and the prisoner's dilemma, which is obviously, the primary example of that. And just hearing you talk, Ali, it's almost like the god of Moloch perpetuates us staying in a prison of our own making through not feeling able to step out of it.
Yes.
And it's so hard to step out of our reality and to see what other choices are out there. Like, life is very stressful, complicated, and I guess psychedelics come into the picture as a way of having a look outside of that prison. Maybe we can't stay out forever, but we can just at least breathe some fresh air, and then there is something out there. And so, maybe bringing psychedelics into it. And you actually just referenced something earlier about skydiving, and skydiving is inherently dangerous. If you're going to jump out of a plane with a parachute, you have to accept that element of danger. It's a little bit like when you eat mushrooms or take MDMA or ayahuasca or DMT. That aspect of danger, on one level, gives us the ability to step out of the prison. And it also, we step into another realm where who knows what may happen. So how do you see psychedelics coming in with Kairos and Moloch and that skydiving danger analogy as well?
Yeah. So basically, the more that I dove into the Moloch metaphor and game theory and big picture cultural sense making, the more I became convinced, and I'm convinced, that the way out of the multipolar trap and the way out of Moloch is the sacred, right? So the sacred, this is where psychedelics come in. The sacred, in some schools of sociology, the sacred doesn't have to be something transcendent on a spiritual level. It can be whatever you hold as a higher value than the game, right? So human life is seen as sacred in many cultures. And so if it's like, so if given the choice of, let's say, publish or perish, and the choice was, right, you can either publish as many academic papers as possible, or you can sacrifice your child, and then you don't have to. No one's going to sacrifice their child, right? Because that is sacred. Love is sacred. Human life is sacred. So there are things that will basically break the rules of that game, and the sacred, it comes in many, many forms. And of course, for some people, humanistic concepts like human life are sacred. For others, and this is where the psychedelics come in, it's that deep connection with the source of things, with like a real deep immersion into reality as it is, and a sense that there is a much deeper reality beyond the social game. That is such a powerful, such a transformative experience that's why I think psychedelics, one of the reasons I think psychedelics are so profoundly important for systems change. And so what psychedelics do in some ways, or can do, is take us into that moment of Kairos, of like, oh my God, like I'm out of the game and I have this moment of, so much possibility. And then, of course, as you said, we do have to go back into the game from there, right? So we have to get very skilled at somehow embedding that way of being and bringing it back into the world, like each of us in our own unique way. And not just that, but embedding a certain, like the teachings from an experience of something beyond, and then somehow embedding that into the society so that it changes the value system of the society. That's a really, really tricky thing to do, and that's what, I talk about this idea called the psychedelic Trojan horse, which is the strategy that's been used by, a lot of the medicalized side of psychedelics and a lot of the people who, quite amazingly and successfully have brought us to this point, researchers, activists, etc. A lot of them, and this is something I've heard in conversation over the years many times, perhaps not given the words Trojan horse, but the idea was, if we can get psychedelics into the culture in the Trojan horse of medicalization, really, which won't trigger the culture, right? And it won't be hippie. Everyone's going to put on a suit. Everyone's going to stop being weird, even though I think many psychedelic researchers are really psychedelic people.
Especially in Imperial College and King's College.
Yeah, exactly. And,
Definitely.
perhaps the newer people entering the field who don't have that rooting in the counterculture and perhaps didn't take the risks early on because of a deep care for these substances, they're coming from not necessarily a worse place, just a different place. It's a different cultural makeup. There's lots of different people entering the space now. But the people who got us this far, a lot of them had this, or have had this kind of idea of the Trojan horse. Okay, once it's in, and once like psilocybin for depression is legalized, then psychedelics will be in the culture and they're going to transform everything. They're just going to So I think that's not true, right? I don't think that's how psychedelics work. Because with psychedelics, as we know, set, setting, and dose are vital, but also the whole cultural container around the psychedelics changes the experience we have. And so, of course, in cultures who have a much deeper, richer science of psychedelics, let's call it, cosmologies, let's say like the Shipibo Konibo, lots of different cultures around the world, they have a rich cosmology that can hold the experience and help them contextualize and make sense of it in different ways. We don't have that in the West because we do not have sacred traditions that have the same power. We used to have Christianity, Judaism. There's a lot of, they're still there, but increasingly young people are not as, they're not as religious anymore. So what we have is humanistic science, which is woefully inadequate at holding deep sacred experience. It's not what it's for, and it can't do it. So it falls short over and over again. And so what we need is a container for the psychedelics to enter culture that can hold the sacred experience. Now, that doesn't mean, in my view, that medicalization is a bad thing. It's just one way to get it into culture. But we also need to bring psychedelics into culture with a very rich, multidisciplinary, inclusive, expansive, complex ways of knowing around them so that people can access them and go, oh, okay, I can make sense of this sacred experience and then apply it to my life. And we don't know how to do that yet. I make some suggestions in the book of where we could look and places we can start and why it's important. But we are right now in quite an exciting phase in the sense that we're in the process of figuring out what does as Rick Doblin said in psychedelic science, like call it the psychedelic 20s, welcome to the psychedelic 20s. Like, okay, to use that metaphor, what's the vibe? What's the vibe of the psychedelic 20s? How do we bring these medicines and molecules into culture in a way that can transform? Because if it gets only captured by the medicalized big pharma model, what we'll get is just a psychedelic version of McDonald's. Right, like it'll just still be that corporate, and that's the idea behind Moloch as well. Is that Moloch is incredibly good at capturing anything that's a threat to the system, stripping away the dangerous elements, i.e., the transformative, subversive elements, and then selling it back to you. So this happened with mindfulness and yoga over the last sort of 25 years. Something that begins as this transformative experience with a very deep history and a very deep cultural context. It becomes Lululemon. Right? It's or it becomes this sort of watered down version of mindfulness, which doesn't talk about death, doesn't talk about transformation, doesn't talk about existential angst and joy. And, it's basically something you do in your corporation to de-stress. I find it so unpalatable because there's something profane about that, right? There's something profane about, which is the opposite of the sacred, about stripping away something magical and making it sort of acceptable to a culture that's already completely broken and empty.
Yeah. How concerned are you, Ali, around the kind of corporatization, medicalization of psychedelics? And in the book, you mentioned Compass Pathways as one example of kind of that IP grab and some of, that the impact of that potentially. And I know Ros Watts has spoken about the Psych Symposium in London last year, and that's come up again, I think this week or next week in London. And that kind of the corporate suits, the lawyers, the IP people, the VC people, that are inevitably going to be part of this matrix of expanding and scaling the medical system. But could it be at the expense of the sacred, of more just grassroots, community-led, community-experienced, and more affordable and accessible psychedelic experiencing and community building?
Yeah. So how worried am I? I'm less worried than I was 2 years ago when all the money started flooding into the space, because a lot of those companies have now gone bust, which is fantastic in my view, because because they were building things. The ones that were building things in a different way haven't, and the ones that were building things as a kind of from a very narrowly focused old paradigm of what healing is and what mental health is, it hasn't worked. And so psychedelics have a certain resilience around them in terms of they won't do what you want them to do. You can't control the trip in the way you decide. You can have agency. Certainly, you can get more skilled at it. So at the same time, and then this is so actually another thing to point out before I go on is that it's very important to separate out the system itself from individual players in the system, right? So there's plenty of people in the most corporate of corporate psychedelia who are trying to enact something meaningful and sustainable and accessible into the world, right? But because of the multipolar trap, because of the race to the bottom way our system is designed, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how well intentioned they are. This is something Jamie Wheel and I talked about. A couple of years ago, I made a few films. I made a film called The Rise of Psychedelic Capitalism, and Jamie spoke to this really well. He talked about this, why, for all the kind of we're going to change the world energy, the multipolar trap gets everyone, right? Unless you change the system, right? So Jamie has a more pessimistic view on that than I do, I think, but I think he makes some really good points as well. So changing, like we're and trying to enact change at the wrong level, trying to bring a new mental health treatment to the market is a problem, because the market is is a huge part of what's causing the mental health crisis. Not just the market, but the underlying reality assumptions of the entire culture. So trying to solve the mental health crisis is kind of absurd, because we don't actually know what's causing it. And the assumption of what's causing it is not good enough drugs was the same kind of assumption that led us to having antidepressants, and will lead to, if we treat psychedelics like that, that will lead to us sitting here in 30 years going, oh, psychedelics aren't healing people anymore. Somehow it's magically not fixing the socioeconomic problems in their lives that are causing or contributing to their illness, or, kind of cycles of childhood trauma that keep recurring because of that system. So now we need a new drug. Maybe it's going to be like some kind of weird metaverse VR drug, right? The can just gets kicked down the road. If we try and enact an old paradigm, and the irony of that is that the great hope of psychedelics is that they can change the paradigms we're working with. And so I'm more hopeful than I used to be, because I do think that psychedelics do have a way of forcing that kind of paradigm shift in individuals. So perhaps they can force that shift in groups, but they won't just magically do that. It's going to require all of us who care about them to do the work like we would internally, and enact, as many people are all around the world, different processes, different systems, different protocols, different ways of protecting indigenous communities from having their medicines just kind of nicked off them and repackaged. There's dozens and dozens and dozens of things we need to do at scale to make sure the psychedelic enlightenment, as I now call it, because of Hieronymo Mazaras, who's I believe he's an anthropologist. He was on one of my symposia at Breaking Convention. He said it's not a psychedelic renaissance anymore. We're now in the psychedelic enlightenment. And I thought, that's brilliant. I'm going to nick that, but I will attribute him because I love that, because we're in this different phase now. The Renaissance was sort of the research starting up again from 2006, 2007. And now we're in this really different phase where we're sort of trying to embed this worldview more, or trying to embed this approach to mental health or personal growth or spiritual exploration more deeply into the society. And we need to do that with great care and responsibility.
There's another cross-cutting theme in your book, Ali. Technology. It comes up again and again, deliberately, obviously. You've thread that through, as well as your DMT experiences, which we'll get to shortly. And you speak about technology as another realm. So I'd love to hear more about that. And also, you talk to the potential positives and negatives of technology and needing to kind of work with it in a sense, because it ain't going away. But kind of, yeah. So what's your sense around technology, kind of what it offers and how it's a similar experience to the psychedelic realm?
Yeah, so by technology, I'm referring mainly to the internet specifically, but also associated technologies with the internet. So for possibly tens of thousands of years, people, especially shamans, have been um, moving between realities. So going from a reality which is what we now call in real life, like just physical reality, into a mental space and a spiritual space, a different realm that has different entities in it, that has different rules, that has different ways of, we have to navigate it in different ways. And this process of dipping in and out of realities um, is now, we've kind of made it come full circle. And now we're all doing that constantly. Like, if you're listening and, it's worth, just noting how many times have you looked at your phone today? I've looked at mine a disturbing amount today. It's really like, and what's happening is that we're when we're doing that, yeah, from one level we're just looking at our phone. From another level, we're going into a different conceptual reality. So we're in an Instagram feed, and it's a symbolic realm full of imagery and feeling and emotion communicated in different ways. And then we look up and we're like walking in a park. It's a different realm, right? So this process of dipping in and out of different realms, I think, is one aspect of the psychedelic experience, which is so, or let's say one aspect that the psychedelic experience can help train us to do better, because it is such a major part of the experience. The realm we're dipping into is increasingly psychedelic. It's intense, it's high salience, which means that there's lots demanding your attention. It's heightened emotionally, like go on Twitter and look at the way people are communicating compared to how much someone might talk to a stranger at a bus stop, right? Everything's heightened, it's faster, it's intense, it's emotional, and now it's full of entities. It's full of AI entities that increasingly we're unable to distinguish from real people. Even the real people you meet online, you're not sure if you're getting catfish. You're not sure if the person is presenting themselves is really who they say they are. So similarly, shamans report that entity encounters are very much like that too. You don't, you got to keep your wits about you with entity encounters. You've got to really, you make allies with certain spirits and not others. You have to kind of be discerning. So deep discernment is another aspect of it. And I talk in the book quite early on about the cognitive science of psychedelics and why it is, and making the case using 4E cognitive science and the work of John Vervaeke, who is a cognitive scientist at the University of Toronto, to look at how doing something in one state can be exapted, it's called. You can take what you learn from that state and then apply it to a different state. So for example, if you start doing Tai Chi, you might then start to be more balanced in the way you look at ideas, right? And the argument is from the latest cognitive science, that we don't just have a brain in our head. Our brain is our entire body, right? It's an embodied cognition. And so we use the same cognitive machinery to move through space as we do to speak. So that's, so everything is interconnected. So when we say like, oh, I really look up to that person, that's a physical word, right? Oh, I had to take a step back for a moment from that situation. Again, it's like physicality. So there's all these different examples of where we see how linked these things are. In the same way, if you can get good at going into a high salience, high emotional environment, like a psychedelic experience, and navigating it well, with discernment, keeping your sovereignty as in your connectedness to yourself, basically keeping your shit together and still being connected to your deepest truth, then we can apply that to the increasingly weird internet that we live in without getting so bamboozled. And that applies to trying to get to the bottom of something like COVID, COVID vaccines, doing your own research, for example, and actually how to do that well, and how to keep your discernment, not jump to conclusions, not need something to be true because it fills a an emotional need, knowing, like, this kind of deeper self-awareness that's required when we're in that kind of environment. Or it might be from just sort of dealing with AI and trying to make sense of AI and figure out, like, okay, how am I going to interact with something that seems to be conscious, but probably isn't, right? How do I make sense of that? How do I feel about it? How am I going to, how am I going to work with it? And that's only going to get more intense. It was happening as I was writing the book. And then after I wrote the book, it just got even more intense. And a year from now, it's just going to be more and more. So I'm particularly interested in the AI side of things. So that basically is, that's a large part of that. And then the final thing I'll say about, like, technology is that one thing our existing technology does is divide us. It divides us. We find it so hard to connect with each other. We're so connected, but we can't connect. It's kind of one of the tragedies of the age we live in. And one thing psychedelics very often do is bring us into deep connection with one another and our shared environment, whether that's through ritual, whether it's at a rave or a festival or in a small group of friends. So there's such a deep connectedness that we can learn and practice through psychedelics together that is almost an antidote and a remedy to this always online, disconnected realm where we don't, or we find it very difficult to experience true intimacy.
Beautiful. And it's really powerful to conceptualize our cell phone as a gateway to Moloch, in a way. That we have this thing in our hands, so we need to approach it with great respect and kind of discipline and sincerity, similar to using psychedelics and kind of moving into that realm, just the approach to it. And in your book, Ali, you mentioned again a lot of times meditation, mindfulness, open-mindedness, and particularly the practice of inquiry that you've used over the years. And then you talk about nature as well. So I'm seeing all of those things, in a sense, as antidotes to having a Moloch relationship with your cell phone or with the internet, to keeping embodied with nature, with real human beings, and with yourself. So you've done a lot of space holding. You've done workshops, you've taught meditation to people, you've run retreats. What is this experience or this space? And you've mentioned as well the sacred within. What is the space you feel like that people are starting to connect with through psychedelics, through meditation, and just holding space within themselves and within each other? And definitely then we can jump into DMT. So talking about those spaces that we open up.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, I think the thing with psychedelics is that we will enter whatever space is being held, So if we're in a particularly held ritual setting, that's likely where we'll go. It'll have a huge impact on our experience. If we're in a completely different setting, like a festival, that's going to have a huge impact on our experience. So, but where I think there's so much deep promise is in combining psychedelics with practices that bring us into deeper connection to ourselves and to each other. So inquiry is one of those practices. And inquiry, the way that I'm trained in it, it comes from the diamond approach, which is sometimes called Ridwan, which is a kind of spiritual school that's also kind of marries a lot of depth psychology. I was founded in the 70s. It was part of my counseling training. It was, the therapists who trained me had been trained in part in that modality along with others. So inquiry is just a practice of a talking meditation is the best way I could describe it. It's a little about journaling out loud. And inquiry is often something two people will do together. And it's, one person will sit opposite the other, and the person who's sharing, say for 10 minutes, just shares. And, if I was doing inquiry right now, I would just be speaking to, like right now, as I'm speaking, I'm noticing this feeling of tangle as I'm trying to figure out what way to talk about it and which way to approach it. And also this like slight fear that if I do it wrong, then I'm gonna have to go back and explain it. And so then actually having explained that, I'm starting to feel like a bit anxious in my legs, like, oh shit, now I've explained a whole other thing, right? So with inquiry, that's kind of what we're doing. And what's beautiful about it is that it takes us somewhere completely new all the time. It's like this unfolding process of, yeah, well, inquiry, right? It's almost like I often interpret it as like you have these threads of, okay, oh, now I'm noticing this. It might be a body sensation, or it might be this kind of like, ooh, this feeling of alertness or aliveness. I wonder what that's about. So the big thing with inquiry is, as Raphael Morgan, one of the therapists who trained me and was a mentor as well, is that inherent in it is the idea of curiosity. It is a curiosity practice, and I think that's such a powerful quality for us all to embody in very uncertain times, is deep sense of curiosity. Uh, and curiosity is really fun too, because it just keeps changing and moving. You can also do inquiry, like in the practice of circling, for example, people might have heard of, where you have multiple people, and lots of inquiry practices do this, where you could do a kind of dialectic inquiry, where you speak to what's alive in the group. So you might say, and this is deeply, deeply powerful for conflict resolution, for coming into coherence with each other. If we can speak together to what's alive in the moment, it can shift everything. And all of this relies on the power of truth. So if you're in a group and you're noticing this kind of tension, let's say, okay, there's something like slightly off, just naming, I feel like there's something slightly off in the dynamic here. I'm just wondering, is anyone else feeling that? And then someone else might say, like, yeah, what I'm noticing is this sense of something unsaid. And then someone else might go, yeah, and actually, as you saying that, I'm actually wondering whether it began like an hour ago when we did that. So it can open everything up. The process of speaking to the truth of your lived experience in the moment is deeply transformative. And it's also in my experience, and I think the experience of many people, it's what psychedelics encourage us to do. They encourage us to be with the truth of our experience, and go into what we've been hiding from and avoiding, and like feel the truth of what's actually going on. And that is so, so powerful culturally, because so many of our cultural shadows and our polarization and our at each other's throats and our ideological fixations come from these unsaid things, right? And so there's so many practices, that psychedelics included, that can open us up into the truth of what's going on. And I think that is just the most transformative practice or approach that there is, that I'm aware of.
Beautiful, beautiful. Hearing what you're saying, Ali, I also learned a new word in the last month. I'm a bit embarrassed, but it's rolling, and different to tripping. And rolling being, more like MDMA experiences, and the kind of rolling nature of the expounding, the experiencing, the feeling, the releasing of different parts of self, different truths, different stories, different feelings, just with that curiosity, with that awareness and inquiry. So I'm feeling like we are rolling now, kind of, and that rolling can sometimes, there can be more that psychonautic trip as well that evolves. And I'm really getting into internal family systems, IFS, at the moment. I haven't done any of the formal trainings, but I'm still reading the book No Bad Parts. And what you were talking about there speaks to the idea of the self-energy, the self with a capital S, self-leadership, really connecting with that. And if we can inquire to finding where that is for each other and holding space together, who knows what can happen. And just thinking about that reconciliation work, and we spoke before about the work of Lior Rosman and Sami with Israel and Palestinian. When we're in that space and when we meet each other in that space, magic happens, and we let go of all that bullshit that we normally get tripped up by.
Yes, I love that. I love I'd heard the term rolling before about MDMA, but only in terms of just like being on MDMA. I really love the way you just described it. I think that's such a beautiful, it's like an unfolding, right? Yeah, I love that. It's different to tripping, right? Tripping is like the ups and downs and the kind of drama, and that, at least that's how I hear the word. So thanks for introducing me.
Rolling's more like being like on a little paddle boat or a paddle board, little, just, taking you, going there, keep going. I'd go this way, go that way, oh, okay.
That's awesome. Yeah.
It's time to go into the DMT realms. Deep breath, Ali.
Again.
So why did you do it? Why did you want to say yes to the experience that the Imperial College crew, the researchers there, were pulling together? So what was that trial, and why did you say yes? How did you prepare for it? And let's just start with those questions.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Why did I say yes? So what did I say yes to? So Imperial College, I've just finished at the time of recording this, and June 2023. They've just finished a trial exploring the effects of intravenous DMT on healthy volunteers. So they're running a really pioneering trial. It's called DMT Extended State. And so they were, as people might be aware, normally DMT, if it's vaporized, it lasts sort of like 10, 15 minutes, and then there's a little bit of afterglow. But the experience is profoundly intense. I'm talking about NN-DMT here, 5-MeO, also incredibly powerful, but different experience. NN-DMT is really associated with the encounter with entities, these kind of seemingly alive beings, and this like incredibly strange, seemingly real reality that you pop into for sort of 10 minutes and then you're out of it and you're just wondering what just happened. And so at the end, so Rick Strassman, who wrote DMT, the Spirit Molecule, at the end of DMT, the Spirit Molecule, which kind of documents the first study on DMT in the 1990s, which was also really the first study of the psychedelic renaissance. He really deserves credit for that. He suggests what would it be like if we could pump people with DMT for a particular amount of time to keep them in the experience. And amazingly, the team at Imperial decided to do that. And I heard about it because I'm friends with Chris Timmerman, the neuroscientist who was running it, and with Lisa Luan, who is a PhD student who is doing a lot of the day-to-day and a lot of, published the first kind of study on the dose finding section of the trial. So they were looking for psychonauts, basically, for the first part of the trial, which was the dose finding. So we were the guinea pigs for the guinea pigs to figure out what is the correct dosage and speed of the pumping the DMT in to give to everyone else. So I think 12 people signed up and 9 people finished. So about a third, a big chunk of people dropped out, or some chunk of people dropped out. It was very intense. And it was about 6 months altogether. And so I said yes, purely out of curiosity and probably a bit of thrill seeking. I was like, what? And I have this vivid memory of, actually, I don't live on the houseboat anymore, but I lived very close to Chris on the houseboat, and it was on the towpath. He told me about it, and I just signed up on the spot. I was just like, yeah, I'm definitely into that. He was like, oh, cool, right, great. Okay, well, someone will, email you.
That was easy.
And then I remember walking away and thinking, this is mental. I really shouldn't have signed up for this. Maybe I should go back. I almost went back to be like, do you know what? I need a bit of time to think about it. And then my curiosity really got the better of me. And I was just fascinated as well to see, okay, well, what's going to happen? I mean, that was my main driving thing was what is going to happen when we're there for that long, and to be one of the first in the world to do it, of a handful of people, that really appealed as well. So then I got really, I started training really hard, like astronaut style. I always think of like a montage, because I was like, okay, I'm going to stop drinking. I'm not going to take any recreational drugs at all. I'm just going to, and I worked with an amazing facilitator and coach called Trish Blaine. She has a model called she has a whole organization called Non-Ordinary, and she uses a model called the 4 Forces, which I found very helpful. And I was already working with her, weekly, doing weekly sessions. And I was like, Trish, I need some help prepping for this experience, right? Like, and part of what I was prepping for was to not give way to amazement. Terence McKenna has this line where he, smoked DMT, and the entities he encountered said to him, don't give way to amazement, because we got stuff to show you, right? Just don't this the kind of initial rush. So I was like, okay, I need to keep myself together so I don't give way to amazement. And then also working on how to navigate state more effectively, how to encounter entities, like that. I did many sessions with Trish around like, how, what is my attitude and bearing going to be when I encounter entities? Because people have all these different ideas about that. And some people are like, oh, you must be kind of worshipful. And, and as we were, prepping for that, Trish's take was like, because she has a lot of experience in non-ordinary states that aren't related to psychedelics, sort of spontaneous or, ecstatic states through, tantra or dancing and etc. And she was like, when I encounter entities, they're just like encountering people. And I was like, yeah, that feels like, because I'd done maybe 50 ayahuasca ceremonies, in the past. So I had a lot of entity encounter experiences, and DMT I'd done maybe 5 or 6 times by itself. So it wasn't like my first rodeo, but I was also really curious about like, okay, this is a scientific trial. And as a participant, I was seeing myself as sort of also running my own scientific inquiry or inner science inquiry. And so really getting clear on, okay, how am I going to encounter entities? And so I came to the point of being like, I'm not going to like be obsequious. I'll be respectful as I would be to another human being. But the idea of like, this is their realm and we're entering their realm, I'm like, yeah, to one degree, but I'm also there. So I don't know where the ownership of the realm comes from, because it's like, I can also swim in the ocean, and it's not a shark's realm. It's the ocean. So in that sense, I was like, okay, well, there's a sort of, what's my right relationship with entities? That was a big part of it as well. And then also just breathing, meditation, resourcing myself, as I would encourage people always in my retreats. I encourage people to, come to what are the resources you need during the trip? The breath being the most important, probably, embodiment, discernment and mindfulness. And then also just, I think, probably for all of us doing this trial, experience, the experience of, this is where the skydiving metaphor comes in pretty well, of, we've all tripped a lot. And so we all had experience of, having been in sticky situations and knowing when to pull a chute and knowing how to have a backup chute ready, etc. So all of that, and a big build up. And then I went to the first dosing, and they hook you up with an EEG helmet and all sorts of cognitive tests. And there's a cannula in your arm with a DMT pump in one arm, and the other arm is a medic taking blood every 2 minutes, basically. And then you put blindfold on, and you have headphones, and you have my case, Chris Timmerman's voice in my head going, intensity rating 0 to 10. And you have to go, 2 or 5 or 9. And then it would say anxiety rating 0 to 10. And they would come at different times, but it would say the minute as well. You know where you were. And the first dosing was a placebo. So I just sat for ages being like, okay, when's it happening? When's it going to happen? And then minute 35, intensity rating, 0. And then I sort of did this whole head trip where I started getting paranoid that they were just fucking with me. First I was like, they're just fucking with me, and this trial is actually not a thing. And this is just all my mates doing kind of April Fool's thing and being like, but you really thought we were going to pump you full of DMT for half an hour? There's no way, you're crazy. And that went through my head. And then I was like, no, it's way too expensive. That's way too expensive a prank. There's no way, no, they would have who would pay for it? I was like, no, that's not happening.
You really went there. I love that, man. Awesome.
Yeah. This dosing didn't come into the book because it just didn't fit. So it's nice to be able to talk about it. Yeah. And then I was like, oh, maybe they're going to dose it at minute 39. They're just suddenly going to go boof, and all of it comes in there. That is not what happened either. So I went back home, and then 2 weeks of sort of okay, that was a bit of an anticlimax. And then my first dosing was a real dosing, and was very, very profound, very much related to a personal situation, and incredibly, incredibly deep, therapeutically deep, and not what I was expecting. I was actually hoping to kind of go very metaphysical, explore hyperspace. I would do that later in the trial, very much so. But this first dosing was so beautiful because I had this experience of what I call the teaching presence of the DMT that was, kind of communicating with me and guiding me. And, in this first one, everything rushed on very, very quickly. They inject it, and it's just like smoking DMT. It's sort of 0 to 1,000 miles an hour in under 3 seconds. And then this teaching presence was like, what are you here for? And it was just quite intense. And I was like, truth. And it was like, that's bullshit. You're not here for truth. What do you really want? I was like, fuck. I was really on the spot. And there's a novelty. And it was like, okay. And then immediately, instead of going into sort of hyperspace full of entities, there were some entities around at that point, but I immediately went into the situation related to my mother and this very ongoing, this kind of long ongoing situation and I was seeing where it affected my trust and intimacy and my connection. The big theme was intimacy, actually, on the first 3 dosings. It's this beautiful journey of my relationship with intimacy, how I show up with other people, the walls I have up to my own feelings. And so really, really beautiful and powerful. And at the end of that first dosing, it was like, look, you can go to hyperspace. I had all these portals around me I could see. And I had the sense of you can kind of that DMT is like a nexus point. You can kind of travel to different places, but it was but you have your emotional baggage is open. You have bags open full of emotional stuff, and you need to like zip up those bags and sort your shit out before you can travel into hyperspace.
Mm.
And that was that was quite a beautiful lesson. And so annoyingly, I had to do the inner work and sort of do stuff. But yeah, of course, that is the way. And so the dosings were one of my deepest lessons from the whole thing was that the metaphysical and the personal aren't these two separate realms. That the metaphysical and the personal, biographical, are deeply interwoven and inseparable. And that was a big lesson for me. Like that was something that I don't think I'd really properly considered. I still had that split between the two. Yeah.
Wow, beautiful. And I'm really pleased you mentioned the teaching presence, because I wanted to explore that, Ali. You mentioned it loads throughout the book, especially throughout the 5 DMT sessions. It was great. They gave you that extra 5th session, by the way, because you were such a good candidate. They like, hey, have another one.
I think
that
was awesome. Me though. I think they gave it to everyone. But it was great. It was great. Yeah.
So yeah, tell me and us about the teaching presence, and what is it? Is it an entity? Where does it live within you? Is it still there? And is it something that you had a relationship prior to the DMT experience?
Yeah. I mean, my experience of all psychedelics, or almost all psychedelics, is this inner dialogue. And I would say it's me, but not me. I mean, what it said to me in the 5th dosing, which was the most powerful, I asked it, like, what are you? And it was like, me, but not me, we, but not we. And I was like, okay, yeah, that's very ambiguous, but it was kind of felt very true. It's like, somehow, I do think everything is one interconnected whole, one sort of mind at large that we're all part of. So in some sense, I think it's like, you could call it higher self or speaking to the divine that I think we all have access to. And in another sense, something very related to a deeper aspect of me, and so this, that experience, it's interesting. DMT is considered to be, at least by Rick Strassman, and certainly I totally agree with this. It's a prophetic experience. That's the kind of mystical experience that is a prophetic one. So instead of the sort of samadhi of all is one and I dissolve into the universe and my individual identity becomes sort of subsumed into something greater, it's much more like Moses speaking to the burning bush. You have the voice of something. You have like agency and encountering. There's angels and demons, and like that's a very equally powerful, but very different type of way of encountering this, the sacred or the sublime or the mystical. And so, was it the voice of the teaching presence of the DMT itself? Yes, I think also that, in a way. It was very similar to the presence on ayahuasca, but it was also distinct. It was also different a little bit. It was a little bit different. So I think almost as a spectrum of consciousness, and it's very difficult. I mean, firstly, I don't know is the answer, but my guess is that there's a kind of spectrum of consciousness, and that we open up to different frequencies in that spectrum on something like DMT, and there's different layers of insight and different layers of sort of wisdom that we're accessing. And I think it's a higher wisdom in the sense that you have a deeper, a higher, broader perspective on yourself. But also, I don't think is just me. I think it was, like I said, me, but not me. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you for trying to explain the ineffable. That was great. Yeah. You were saying the teaching presence answered you. I'm you, but not you. We are we. But there's a teaching in my tradition as well. One of the 72 names of God is Ehyeh, Asher, Ehyeh. Like, I will be that which I will be. And it's kind of this teaching presence. It's this energy, of wisdom. And it's interesting, Moloch is actually mentioned in the Torah as well. It speaks about the Canaanite god and the giving the child sacrifices, and the Hebrew Israelite we're going to do something a bit different, like making sacrifices to God, which is the way they went. I'd like to ask about another entity maybe that came up in your DMT experience. I think she was an entity, the Spider Queen.
Yeah.
So she came up a few times.
Everyone asked about the Spider Queen. Yeah.
So who was she? What was she like? And how was it kind of meeting her and building relationship with her, and what she teach you? And yeah, I'd love to hear a bit more about her.
Yeah. So this was in my second dosing. And just to explain, so the way the book is structured is that it's probably about 75% sort of bigger picture looking at the world and the role of psychedelics. And then the rest of it is my experiences on the DMTX trial that I sort of weave in to pull out themes, and also just to give a sort of like subjective experience of psychedelics, because often that's missing from books on psychedelics. You know, it's just like, it is the thing. Like those experiences that we have are the psychedelic experience. So I thought it was really important to put them in. So yeah, this was on my second dosing, and it was, so I was in this moment where I was sort of floating. Often the dosing, I would start off in this sort of cavern, which felt contained. This is quite a common experience on DMT. I felt like I was in a sort of holding area, and then I would break through from that in different directions. And in this case, I broke through into what was like a vast galaxy. It was like outer space. I was in this galaxy of these gigantic, like planet-sized entities. Huge, right? And some of them were like cities. Like it was like some of them were kind of like living city planets. I mean, it was wild. It was wild, and I'm sort of floating. And I had their teaching presence with me, very much almost like a guide, you know? And so, and I very much had the sense of my body floating in space. I wasn't like disembodied. I was disembodied, but in a sense, like, I feel like I could look down and would have seen my body in some way, right? That was the kind of feeling of it. And one of these planet-sized entities, most of them just did not care I was there, right? They could not be less interested in little old me floating around. But this one I was really drawn to, and I sort of moved towards it. And it was kind of like a planet-sized spidery cocoon, really dark in color, but somehow really alluring. Like I felt this kind of, I felt really like, wasn't quite sexual, but it was kind of like cocky and masculine and like, oh yeah, like, oh well, you're trying to seduce me, because it was very seductive. It was like pulling me in, and I basically, you know, I was sort of like keeping my distance, being like, yeah, I'm not going to be able to be seduced. I'm too macho. Basically, it was weird. It was really interesting. I kind of felt very different. I felt sort of like really cocky.
Like you didn't want to get entangled in the web?
Didn't want to get entangled, yeah, and wouldn't. And then as I was saying that, I realized that I was already entangled. And she, as I'd been like machoing, she had been like subtly maneuvering this web. And then suddenly I was inside the web, and I was sort of like in awe. I was like, wow, I've been bested. So like thoroughly bested. And then it was beautiful. I have to say, in terms of visual experience, it was one of the most stunning things I've ever seen on a psychedelic. I mean, just really hyper 4K, 20K definition inner web. And then it was like, I was kind of playing this game of being engulfed, but holding back as well. Like, will I merge? Won't I? Was the big thing. And then also I started getting like really into like, it was dark, and I started like being like, okay, yeah, let me see the darkness. I was like really leaning in. I do a lot of, or don't do a lot of, but I'm a big believer in shadow work. So if I encounter darkness in a psychedelic experience, I enthusiastically lean into it. You know, I'm like, great, bring it. Like, let's see how dark and disturbing this can be. And so she then, like, the Spider Queens just start showing this dark images and energy. And I was like, yeah, great. Okay. And then it was like, again, this desire to merge. And I was like holding back. I was like, I don't want to merge with the Spider Queen. I don't know what's going to happen. And then the teaching presence came on. You know, this would often happen. Like the teaching presence would like pop up again. And it was like, yeah, you're afraid of merging with other people. Like you're afraid of intimacy, like, you know, and you're afraid of it, you know, in my relationship and with the feminine. And I was like, oh yeah, fine. But maybe I am. What's wrong with that? Like, what am I missing out on? And then like the word love was like written around the web. And I was like,
wow.
I like laughed. I was like, wow, that's really deep. And it's great because the scientists are, so Lisa Luan was marking down like every movement and every laugh and everything. So after the dosing, you're able to be like, so like minute like 34, you laughed. Do you remember why? And it kind of helps you go back. You're like, oh yeah, that was because of this. So at the end of this encounter was really interesting because it went on for a bit, and then I decided not to merge, right? And I made this kind of conscious decision where I was like, no, I don't, which I don't necessarily think was right or wrong. It's just where I was at. And then the Spider Queen was a little bit like affronted and like spurned, you know, and sort of floated off. And then it really stuck with me because I was like, I don't know whether I should have, for my psychic wholeness, merged, because it was unclear whether that was an entity or whether it was like a subpersonality or a representation of my unconscious that, like, you know, in other cases when that's happened, I've done this, method of kind of bringing it into wholeness, bringing the part into the whole, and then I have a deeper sort of resolution around that particular issue in my life or that particular part of myself. But also there was something alien about the Spider Queen, and it could just be that it was, I couldn't do the full shadow work, but also I had this feeling that what was going on, I couldn't be like, okay, it's either an entity that's independent or it's some aspect of myself. And where I landed on was that it was somehow both, which I know sounds really paradoxical, but it had the feeling of like, if you had like a spiritual teacher and they saw that you had some kind of like tangle or hang up, they might like take you to a marketplace and be like, okay, this guy who runs a stall is a real asshole and he's really going to trigger this person massively. So basically going to engineer an interaction between them, and then that'll be the lesson. That's what it felt like. It's not so much like the Spider Queen was there all for me, or like it was entirely generated by my mind. It was almost like I was led to that encounter with something that I felt existed, right? And I felt this mistrust and this alienness as well. So really wild. It was the wildest entity encounter I have ever had, I would say. Yeah.
Beautiful. Amazing. Thanks for describing that bit where love came up on the web. Yeah. All right. So I've got one more question before we close out, Ali. And you mentioned love and intimacy being really key kind of experiences and takeaways from those DMT journeys. You also in your book mentioned your wife, Ashley Murphy Beiner, a bunch of times.
Yeah.
So I'm interested, what's it like living with someone and being married to someone who also works in psychedelics? She was one of our teachers about her psilocybin for depression trials at Imperial College. And from an integration perspective as well, what's that been like, kind of colleagues in the space, but also, colleagues in love and intimacy and integration work?
Yeah. I mean, overall great, like there's something really special about, we both kind of, when we met, we've been together for a long time, together 13, almost 14 years. And so we were both into psychedelics already personally, and really interested in them. And then we've kind of in many ways grown together and both been in the field and done different things. So on the one hand, it's really like inspiring. I think I'm certainly inspired by her thinking a lot and the research she's doing. She's a psychologist and there's also published research on ayahuasca. So that's really inspiring. And I think we share ideas with each other and kind of help build the ideas. On the downside, we talk about psychedelics an awful lot. We have to not sometimes. Sometimes we're just like, one of us will just be like, I can't talk about psychedelics anymore tonight. I can't. We've got to watch some reality TV or something. Yeah. So there's that, but that's also kind of contextual because right now she's finishing her thesis, which is on really interesting on qualitative study in psychedelics, and is doing a few other qualitative studies with Imperial, and that's all sort of like her thesis is wrapping pretty soon. So I think once that's done, there'll be less. We'll be able to kind of have the balance a little bit more. And of course, I was writing a book for kind of six or 8 months. So then I'm obviously talking about stuff. So we've both gone through the other person being very immersed at different times. But and in integration, it's beautiful because also we can help each other to integrate in a way that would be more difficult with a partner perhaps who wasn't familiar or was a bit skeptical of. At the same time at Psychedelic Science, I met up with a friend who's we were having this conversation because she's just started going out with someone who's basically an extreme sports person, nothing to do with psychedelics, and talking about how refreshing that can be as well. But then the downside being that, this is a big part of your life that it's harder to share about sometimes. So there's, maybe less interest. So I can see pros and cons, but overall it's a nice situation.
Beautiful. Thanks for sharing. And there's also extreme sports. There's that risk and danger aspect that psychedelics shares with it too. Interesting.
Actually, that's a good point. It is like an extreme sport of the mind, isn't it?
All right, Ali. I've loved this chat, man. We could go on, but I want to just give you an opportunity to tell folks about where they can find your book and where they can kind of just link up with everything that you're doing, where you exist in the world. And also there's a retreat, regenerative stewardship retreat, Awaken the Medicine Within, that I just saw. We haven't talked about that, but that just looked really interesting. If you want to mention it, feel free.
Yeah, I'll mention that. So I work with the wonderful Natasha Pelgrim, running a retreat called Regenerative Stewardship in the Netherlands, sort of legal truffle retreat, where we combine a lot of the work that I've been doing over the years, the kind of relational, interpersonal work, and then ceremonial work with truffles and also breath work as well. So that is happening in the next one after this comes out would be in November. So people can check that out on Awaken the Medicine Within. That's Natasha's company, what we goes through. And then, yeah, The Bigger Picture, my book, is available all over the place. So it's on Amazon and Audible as well. I read the audiobook, which was a lot of fun to do, actually. I quite really enjoyed that.
Yeah, I love listening to your voice. It's awesome.
Thanks, man. And then also it's in like Barnes & Noble and Waterstones. And in Australia, it's on Booktopia, I believe. So, yeah, and then people can just check out my website, alexanderbeiner.com. I also write regularly on Substack. I have a Substack that's also called The Bigger Picture, where I write not just about psychedelics. In fact, I mainly write about bigger picture things and sort of from pop culture to science and psychology to whatever I suddenly become interested in and want to delve into. So yeah.
Beautiful. And yeah, I've listened to your book and it's awesome hearing you talk it out. And the next book that I've just started on Audible, my second one, is Terence McKenna, Flesh of the Gods.
Oh, amazing. I can't compete with McKenna, but that's
yeah. There's some similarities there, like the approach that you're taking. So
he's a huge influence on me. So yeah,
it feels that way. And thanks so much for writing this book. I think it needed to be written, Ali, just to cover the complexity with nuance, not with hype. And to talk about the role of psychedelics and the sacred.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really, really, really appreciate that, and thanks for having me on and for what was a really enjoyable conversation for me. So yeah, thanks, man.
Beautiful. All right, Alexander Beiner, thank you so much. We'll see you soon, folks. Thanks for listening.